Can my wife rest here, just for a little while? His voice barely made it across the room. 78 years old. Hands shaking. Shirt soaked through with sweat. Standing in the doorway of a Hells Angels clubhouse in the Montana mountains with 40 pairs of eyes on him and every single reason in the world to turn around and walk back to his dying wife in a car that would never start again. He didn't turn around. He stood there and he asked, and the most feared biker in the state of Montana looked at this old man and stood up. What happened next changed everyone in that room forever. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Thomas Walker had spent 53 years being the kind of man who handled things himself. That was not a boast. It was not even something he'd chosen consciously, the way people choose beliefs or preferences, or the side of the bed they sleep on. It was simply who he was built into him by a father who believed that asking for help was a form of failure, and reinforced over 5 decades of a life that had until relatively recently allowed him to believe that self-sufficiency was a sustainable arrangement. He had handled the mortgage when the payments got difficult. He had handled the medical bills when Evelyn's heart started requiring the kind of attention that insurance companies reviewed very carefully before deciding how much of it they felt like covering. He had handled the negotiations, the payment plans, the phone calls that lasted 40 minutes and accomplished nothing. The letters he drafted and redrafted on a kitchen table in a house in Billings that he had owned for 21 years. He had handled it right up until he couldn't. The house went first. Not dramatically, not the way houses go in movies with sheriffs and boxes on lawns and neighbors watching from behind curtains. It went the way most things go when debt accumulates past a certain point. Quietly, paperwork by paperwork. Until one morning the paperwork said it was done, and the house that had been theirs for 21 years belonged to someone else's ledger. They moved into a 1-bedroom apartment. Thomas handled that too. It was smaller than they were used to, and the heating was unreliable, and the neighbors on the left played music at hours that suggested they had a fundamentally different relationship with sleep. But it was a roof, and Thomas could look at a roof and feel like he was still doing what a man was supposed to do. Then the fire. It started in the apartment above them, electrical, the kind of thing that investigators explain afterward with technical language that translates to, nobody did anything wrong, and everything was lost anyway. Thomas got Evelyn out. That was what mattered. He got her out in her nightgown at 2 a.m. with her heart medication in his coat pocket because he had the presence of mind, even at 2 a.m., with smoke coming through the ceiling, to grab the orange prescription bottle from the nightstand before he grabbed anything else. Everything else burned. The insurance payout, when it came, was enough to buy a used station wagon and survive for approximately 4 months if they were careful. Thomas was always careful. He stretched it to 6. By the time the 6 months were finished, he and Evelyn had a system which motels would let them pay for a single night with cash, and no questions which gas stations had the cleanest restrooms, which parking lots were safe enough for sleeping, which diners offered senior discounts that brought a meal within range of what they could spend. They had been living this system for 7 months when the car died outside the clubhouse. It died the way old things die when they have been asked to carry too much for too long. Not with drama, not with warning, just a sound that was different from the usual sounds, and then a slowing, and then a stopping, and then silence. Thomas sat behind the wheel for a moment after the engine went quiet. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. Then he looked at Evelyn. She was not looking at him. Her head was against the window, her eyes half closed, her breathing audible in a way that had started 3 hours ago and had been getting gradually more audible with each passing mile of Montana highway in July heat that the car's failing air conditioning had been losing the argument against since morning. Her face was the color that faces turn when the body is making demands the person is trying not to acknowledge. "Evie," he said. "I'm fine," she said. She had been saying this since noon. "You're not fine." "Thomas?" Her voice had the particular patience of a woman who has been married to the same man for 53 years and has learned the precise tone required to end a specific category of conversation. I am fine. What happened to the car? It stopped. She opened her eyes fully and looked at him. Stopped how? Stopped entirely. She looked out the window at where they had stopped. Thomas had not yet looked. He was still looking at her, doing the calculation he'd been doing silently all afternoon. The calculation about heat and hydration, and the heart medication she'd taken this morning, and whether the combination of those factors was approaching a number he didn't know how to handle. He finally looked out the window. The building was weathered and large, set back from the road with a gravel lot that held somewhere between 30 and 40 motorcycles in an arrangement that suggested they had been ridden here with purpose, and would be ridden away with the same. Above the main door, in letters that had been there long enough to acquire authority, was a name that Thomas Walker had never expected to find himself parked directly in front of. Hell's Angels. He sat with that for a moment. In 78 years of life, Thomas had constructed a detailed picture of what those two words meant, built from decades of news coverage and cultural osmosis, and the specific fear-adjacent instinct that respectable people of his generation had been encouraged to feel toward anything that looked like organized lawlessness. He knew what Hell's Angels meant. He knew what the patches meant. He knew what it meant that 40 motorcycles were parked in a lot outside a building in the mountains of Montana on a Tuesday afternoon. He knew all of it. He also knew that his wife was sitting beside him with her eyes half closed and her breathing audible, and the temperature outside the car was 94 degrees. He opened the car door. Thomas. Evelyn's voice was sharper now. The sharpness of fear which she expressed as authority had always expressed that way for 53 years. I'm just going to ask, he said. Ask them, Thomas, those are. I know what they are. He looked at her directly. I also know what you are, and right now I'm more concerned about you. He paused. I'll be right back. He got out of the car before she could continue the argument, because he had learned over 5 decades that some arguments were better lost quickly than won slowly, and he was not going to win this one, and he did not have time for slow. He walked across the gravel. He was aware of himself walking across the gravel in a way he hadn't been aware of his own movement in a long time, the specific self-consciousness of a man in his late 70s, in clothes that had been worn too many consecutive days, walking toward a door that everything in his experience told him not to walk toward. He was aware of his age in his hips and his knees. He was aware of the sweat on the back of his neck. He was aware that his hands were doing something they didn't normally do. A slight unsteadiness that he refused to call shaking, because he needed it to stop, and sometimes refusing to name things was the only way to address them. He pushed the door open. The shift from outside to inside was a shift from heat to relative cool, not air conditioning exactly, but shade and fans and the specific temperature of a large enclosed space that had thick walls. Thomas registered this the way his body registered it, with a relief he didn't have room to fully feel yet. He registered something else first. The room was full. Not packed full the way a room is full when the people in it are large and present in a way that takes up more space than their physical dimensions technically require. He counted without meaning to, old habit teacher's habit. He'd taught high school history for 31 years, somewhere between 35 and 40 men, most of them in leather vests, most of them with the particular physical vocabulary of people who had lived in their bodies as working instruments for many years. They were at tables at the bar along the far wall in chairs pulled into groupings that suggested ongoing conversations now paused. Every one of them was looking at him. The silence was the kind that has texture. Not hostile exactly. He would think about this later about that distinction, but dense. The silence of a room collectively processing an unexpected input and waiting for more information before deciding what to do with it. Thomas Walker stood inside the door of a Hells Angels clubhouse in Montana, and he looked at the room, and the room looked back at him, and he thought about Evelyn's breathing, and he opened his mouth. "Can my wife rest here?" he said, "just for a little while." His voice came out steadier than his hands felt. He was grateful for that. The silence continued for a moment that lasted longer than its actual duration. And then a man in the back of the room stood up. He was not the largest man in the room, though he was large. He was not the most visibly tattooed, though Thomas could see ink from across the space. What he was, what Thomas registered before he registered anything specific about the man's appearance, was the particular quality of someone that rooms orient around. The way iron filings orient around a magnet. Not because anyone was told to, not because of explicit hierarchy in this moment, but because it was simply the direction the room naturally faced. He stood up and he walked toward Thomas without hurrying, and the path he took across the room was direct and unhurried, and the men he passed moved slightly without being asked the small adjustments of people making space for someone they were accustomed to making space for. He stopped in front of Thomas. He was maybe 58, 59 with a blonde beard going silver at the edges and blue eyes that were, Thomas would think later, the most alert eyes he had ever looked directly into. Not aggressive, not calculating in the way of people who are thinking about angles, but present in a way that most eyes weren't. Fully there. Looking at Thomas the way someone looks when they are actually seeing the person in front of them rather than the category the person represents. "Jack Morrison," the man said. His voice was deep and unhurried. "Thomas Walker." Thomas paused. "My wife is in our car. We've been driving since this morning in this heat, and she needs to sit somewhere cool. Rest. The car stopped running and I don't know." He stopped himself. Edited. "I just need somewhere for her to rest." Jack Morrison looked at him for approximately 3 seconds. Thomas would replay those 3 seconds later, would try to parse what was happening in them. Some kind of assessment, certainly. But not the transactional kind, not the kind that was running calculations about liability or inconvenience or the optics of helping strangers. Something older than that. Something that came from a place below policy. "Where's the car?" Jack said. "Just outside, left side of the lot." Jack turned to the room. "Somebody get the door," he said. Not loudly. He didn't need volume. "Ray, get the cold water from the kitchen. Marcus, I need you out front with me." He was already moving toward the door before he finished the sentence. Thomas turned and followed him and was aware peripherally of the room reorganizing itself behind them. People standing, moving, the sound of boots on floor. The specific sound of a group of people shifting from stillness into coordinated purpose. Jack reached the car before Thomas did, covering ground with a ease that reminded Thomas of certain men he'd known who had been in the military and carried the physical efficiency of it permanently in how they moved. He opened the passenger door, and he crouched down beside it, and he looked at Evelyn and Thomas, watched him do it, and the thing he noticed, the thing that went directly past every preconception he'd carried across that gravel lot, and into a place in his chest that he didn't examine immediately, because there wasn't time, was the gentleness. Jack Morrison, whose name Thomas would later learn had traveled across 3 states in front of him like weather, crouched beside an elderly woman he'd never met and spoke to her the way you speak to someone's grandmother, quietly, directly, without performance. "Mrs. Walker," he said. "I'm Jack. Can you tell me how you're feeling right now? Any chest pain?" Evelyn looked at him. Evelyn Walker had a finely calibrated instinct for people honed across 76 years and 5 decades of marriage to a man she'd chosen partly for the accuracy of his own instincts. She looked at Jack Morrison for the same 3 seconds he'd given Thomas, and something in her face, the guardedness that had been there since Thomas got out of the car, shifted. Not disappeared. Shifted. The specific shift of someone who has made a preliminary decision to extend provisional trust. "Some dizziness," she said. "My heart's been doing something it shouldn't since this morning. I have medication." "You took it," Jack said. "This morning. I'm due for the afternoon dose." She paused. "We were going to find somewhere to stop." "You've stopped," Jack said simply. "Can you stand with some help?" "I can stand." "Okay." He stood and offered his hand, and it was simply offered, no hesitation, no calculation, just a hand extended to a woman who needed one. Evelyn took it, and a man named Marcus Large, quiet with the particular posture Thomas would later learn to identify as former military, appeared on her other side, and together they brought Evelyn Walker out of the station wagon and into the shade. She took her first full breath in hours. Thomas watched it happen. watched the shallow, audible breathing shift into something deeper, something that cost less, as her body registered the drop in temperature and the cessation of direct sun. Her color was still wrong, but it was less wrong than it had been, and he felt something in his own chest release that he hadn't fully identified as held until it let go. Thomas. Her voice was quieter now, not the authority voice, something underneath it. I know, he said. I told you I was fine. You were not fine. She looked at him with 53 years of marriage in her eyes. I know, she said. Inside the clubhouse, a man named Danny, who had been an army medic for 8 years before he became a biker, and who had therefore seen the specific intersection of heat and age and cardiac stress enough times to take it seriously, sat across from Evelyn with a blood pressure cuff and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that calm was itself a form of medicine. Thomas sat beside her and held her hand. He looked around the room while Danny worked at the men moving around them with a purposeful quiet that he hadn't expected. Bringing water, bringing ice wrapped in a cloth, moving furniture to create more space. The collaborative efficiency of people who knew how to respond to a situation without being told the specifics of each step. He looked at Jack Morrison, who had positioned himself near the door, not hovering, not watching in the way that made you feel watched, but present in the way of someone who had assumed responsibility for a situation and was tracking it without making the tracking the focus. How long? Jack said to Danny. Not loudly. Give her 20 minutes for the core temperature to come down, Danny said. BP's high but not crisis level. She needs fluids, her afternoon meds, and somewhere cool to sit for the rest of today. Jack nodded. He looked at Thomas. You eaten today? Thomas paused. The pause was long enough to be its own answer. No, he said. Both of you. We were going to find somewhere. He stopped. The sentence completed itself in the space between them. Jack turned to the bar. Pete, he said. Whatever's hot in the kitchen, 2 plates. He looked back at Thomas. Any dietary restrictions? Anything she can't have? Thomas looked at his wife. Evelyn's eyes were closed, her head resting back against the chair. Her color better now, genuinely better. The pink returning to her face in increments that Thomas was tracking the way he tracked things that mattered to him absolutely. She can't have too much sodium, he said. Heart. Pete, Jack said. Low salt. On it, Pete said and disappeared. Thomas looked at Jack Morrison. He had 100 questions. He had the instinct, the strong practiced deeply habitual instinct to explain himself, to justify his presence, to provide the context that would explain why a 78-year-old man in a sweat-soaked shirt was sitting in a Hells Angels clubhouse asking for help feeding his wife, to establish that he was a retired schoolteacher, that he had owned a home, that this was not who he was or who he had been, that the circumstances were. Jack Morrison spoke first. You don't have to explain anything, he said. Thomas looked at him. I can see what I need to see, Jack said. The rest is none of my business unless you want it to be. Thomas sat with that for a moment. In 78 years, he could count on one hand the number of times someone had offered him that particular thing, the specific gift of not being required to justify himself, of having his situation accepted as it was, rather than measured against what it should have been. Thank you, he said. The words came out smaller than he intended, compressed by something he didn't have a name for in this moment. Jack nodded once. He moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. Your car, he said. When did it last have a full service? Thomas thought about it. 2 years ago, he said. Maybe 3. We've been... He stopped. Okay, Jack said. Don't worry about it tonight. Thomas didn't ask what that meant. He should have asked. He would think later that he should have asked, should have established the boundary, should have been clear about what he could and couldn't accept. He didn't ask because Evelyn's breathing had finally fully normalized, because the food was coming from the kitchen, because the ice on her wrist was working, because a man named Danny was writing down her blood pressure with the focused attention of someone who intended to monitor it, and because Thomas Walker was for the first time in 7 months sitting somewhere that felt against all logic, against every expectation he'd carried across a gravel lot, like someone had said, "You're allowed to stop here." He was 78 years old. He had been handling things alone for 53 years. He sat in a Hells Angels clubhouse in Montana, and he held his wife's hand, and he let himself just for a moment stop. Outside, without being asked, without any instruction, Thomas had heard 3 men in leather vests had their hands on the hood of the dead station wagon. They were already working. The food arrived in 20 minutes. Thomas knew, because he counted old habit, couldn't stop it even now, and the 20 minutes between Jack Morrison's quiet instruction to Pete and the moment 2 plates appeared on the table in front of him and Evelyn were the kind of 20 minutes that a person doesn't forget. Not because anything dramatic happened in them, because nothing had to. Because sitting in a cool room with his wife's color returning and a blood pressure reading that Danny called manageable, not critical, and the sound of men working outside on a car that had given up all of that together in 20 minutes was more than Thomas had been given in 7 months, and the accumulation of it was doing something to the inside of his chest that he was carefully not examining. Evelyn ate slowly. She always ate slowly. Had always been the deliberate one at the table. The one who tasted things, who paid attention, who could tell Thomas 3 hours after dinner exactly what had been in the sauce. Tonight she ate slowly, because her hands had not entirely stopped their fine trembling, and she was managing the fork with the focused precision of someone who refuses to let a physical limitation become visible. Thomas ate faster than he'd intended to. He didn't realize how fast until he looked down and the plate was half empty and he hadn't tasted anything. 7 months of rationing had rewired something in his relationship with food that he was only now noticing sitting here where rationing wasn't required, where there was more on the plate than he absolutely needed. He set his fork down, deliberately slowed. "It's good," Evelyn said, without looking up from her plate. "It is. The potatoes especially." "Yeah?" She looked up at him. The look lasted just a second, the specific look of 53 years, the one that contained everything they didn't need to say out loud, about where they were, and what it had taken to get here, and what it meant that they were eating a hot meal in a room they'd had no reason to expect to be in. Then she looked back at her plate. Danny came by and checked her pressure again at the 30-minute mark. He wrote the number in a small notebook he kept in his vest pocket with the casual competence of someone for whom this was simply a thing he did as natural as checking the time. "Better?" he said. "Still want her to take it easy for the rest of tonight. No exertion, cool fluids, another check before she sleeps." He looked at Thomas directly. "She's stable. But I want to be honest with you, the combination of heat dehydration and the cardiac situation she's managing, that's a stack of stressors that doesn't give much warning before it becomes a crisis. You understand what I'm telling you?" Thomas understood exactly what he was telling him. "Yes," he said. "Good." Danny put the notebook away. "The medication she's on, I know the protocol. She took her afternoon dose." "Just now," Evelyn said. "I'm sitting right here, Daniel." Danny smiled. It was the smile of a man who had dealt with a great many patients who objected to being discussed in the third person. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "how are you feeling?" Honestly, Evelyn considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Better than an hour ago," she said. "Tired. The dizziness has mostly passed." She paused. "My chest feels—" She touched it lightly just below the collarbone. "There's a heaviness. Has been since this morning." Danny's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Scale of 1 to 10, the heaviness. 3, she said. Then honestly, maybe a 4. "I'm going to sit with you for another 20 minutes and monitor," Danny said. It was not a question. "You don't have to," Thomas started. "I know I don't have to," Danny said, pulling up a chair with the ease of someone who had decided something and was not revisiting the decision. Thomas looked at him. At this man in his late 40s in a leather vest with tattoos on both forearms, sitting beside his wife with a blood pressure cuff and a notebook, monitoring her cardiac situation with the quiet focus of someone who had trained for this and had never stopped being the person who trained for it. regardless of what he looked like or where he was sitting. He looked away before the feeling in his chest could organize itself into something he'd have to address. Jack came back inside at the 40-minute mark. He came from outside, and he brought with him the particular energy of someone who has been receiving information and processing it in the background while doing other things. He crossed the room to Thomas with the same unhurried directness he'd shown in every interaction so far, and he sat down across from him without being asked. And Thomas noticed that every person in the room tracked him as he moved, and then returned to what they were doing, the unconscious orientation of a group around its center. "Tell me about the car," Jack said. Thomas told him. The age of it, 11 years. The last full service he revised his earlier estimate, it had been closer to 4 years. The financial reality of the last several years had pushed certain things down the priority list. The sound it had made before it stopped. The way it had been running rough for the last 200 miles. Jack listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, Jack was quiet for a moment. "My guy outside Hector, he knows engines the way some people know languages. Born into it. His father ran a garage in Tucson for 40 years. He paused. "Hector says the engine itself is gone. Not repairable, replaceable, but not repairable." Thomas absorbed this. He ran the numbers automatically. The calculation his mind went to before he could stop it. The reflex of a man who had been running numbers for 7 months, who had built a survival system out of knowing exactly what things cost, and exactly what was available, and exactly how much margin existed between those two figures. The margin was 0. It had been 0 for a long time. "All right," Thomas said. His voice was level. He had gotten good at level. "Thomas." Jack's voice was not unkind. It was direct in the way of someone who valued directness as a form of respect. "What's the plan after tonight? Where were you headed?" Thomas looked at him. The honest answer was nowhere specific. They had been headed in the direction of somewhere that might present an option, a shelter, a program, a church that did something on weeknights. The vague forward momentum of people who have learned that stopping completely is more dangerous than moving without destination. But nowhere specific. He had told this story to 3 people in the last 7 months, a social worker in Billings who had been genuinely sympathetic and genuinely overwhelmed, a pastor in a town whose name he'd already half forgotten, who had given them a parking lot to sleep in for 2 nights, and a woman at a gas station who'd given them $20 without being asked, and whose face he remembered perfectly, and whose name he'd never learned. He told it now to Jack Morrison, and he told it straight, the way he'd learned to tell it without apology, without the self-diminishment that people in his situation were sometimes expected to perform, but also without editorializing because the facts were sufficient, and adding emotion to them wasn't something he had energy for. He told him about the house, the medical debt, the fire, the 7 months, the system of parking lots and cash motels and gas station restrooms and senior discounts and the orange prescription bottle he'd grabbed on his way out of a burning apartment building. Jack listened to all of it. He did not say "I'm sorry." Thomas had heard "I'm sorry" enough times in 7 months to have developed a complicated relationship with the phrase. Not because it wasn't meant sincerely. Usually it was, but because sincerity and utility were different things, and "I'm sorry" had a very low utility-to-syllable ratio when you were trying to figure out where to park for the night. What Jack said was, "How's her heart?" "Before today, I mean. How's she been managing?" Thomas blinked. The question landed sideways, not what he'd expected, not the logistical follow-up, not the referral to resources response he'd gotten from the social worker in Billings. Just "How's her heart?" "Some days better than others," he said. "The heat's been hard. She won't say so. She strikes me as someone who doesn't say so about a lot of things." 53 years, Thomas confirmed. Something moved in Jack's expression. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one or the precursor. "How'd you two meet?" Thomas looked at him. The question was so far outside the conversation he'd been prepared for that for a moment he just registered it without responding. "High school," he said finally. "I was 17. She was 15. I asked her to a football game and she told me she didn't like football." "What did you do?" "I told her I didn't like it much either." He paused. I had been on the team for 2 years at that point. This time Jack did smile. It was a real one, brief, genuine, the kind that changes the whole geography of a face. Did she ever find out? Jack said. She found my jersey in the attic in 1987, Thomas said. We'd been married 16 years. She didn't speak to me for 2 days. He paused. Then she framed it. It was in the living room until the fire. The smile faded from Jack's face in the specific way that things fade when someone realizes they've arrived at the weight of something. I'm sorry about the fire, he said. And somehow coming after the football story, after the jersey, after 16 years of marriage, and Evelyn not speaking to him for 2 days, and then framing the evidence of his minor teenage deception, somehow coming after all of that. Those 4 words landed differently than they ever had before. Landed in the place below logistics, the place that I'm sorry almost never reached. Thomas looked at the table. Thank you, he said. Across the room, Evelyn had fallen into a light sleep in the chair. Danny was still beside her notebook, open pencil, moving in small notations. The room around them had the quality of a space in which people had unconsciously modulated their volume. Not silent, not artificially quiet, but gentled, the way rooms gentle around sleeping things. Thomas looked at his wife, and then at the room, and then at Jack Morrison. Why are you doing this? He said. The question came out without strategic intention he hadn't planned to ask. It hadn't decided it was a question he had the right to ask. It simply emerged the way things emerge after enough time in a room where your defenses have been systematically disarmed by kindness you weren't prepared for. Jack was quiet for a moment. Because you walked through that door and asked, he said. That's the whole reason. That's most of it. He paused. The rest I'll tell you another time. Thomas accepted this. There was something in the way Jack said another time that wasn't dismissive. It was the phrasing of someone who intended the another time to exist, who was not using it as a polite deflection. Hector's outside, Thomas said carefully. With the car. I heard you tell him something when we came in. What did you tell him? Jack met his eyes. I told him to look at everything, not just what stopped working. And when he finds what stopped working, he'll fix it. Jack! Thomas kept his voice even. He had to. I can't pay for... I know. I have to be clear about you, Thomas. Jack's voice was not loud, and it was not harsh, and it stopped the sentence anyway, the way a hand placed on a table stops a rolling object. I understand what you're saying. I understand why you're saying it. And I'm telling you that the car is going to be taken care of and there is no transaction here. This is not something you owe. He paused. Can you accept that? Thomas Walker, retired schoolteacher, former homeowner man, who had handled things himself for 53 years, looked at the most feared biker in Montana across a table in a clubhouse where his wife was sleeping safely and her blood pressure was being monitored and someone was fixing their car outside. He thought about what it cost to accept something. He had a detailed internal accounting of this. He had been building it for 7 months every time someone offered something, and he calculated whether accepting made him something he didn't want to be, whether the cost of receiving was more than the cost of going without. He had turned down things. He had insisted on repayment when repayment was impossible. He had maintained the architecture of self-sufficiency, past the point where the architecture was load-bearing, because the architecture was the last thing that felt like who he was. He looked at Jack Morrison. He thought about Evelyn's breathing in the car, about the car going quiet on a mountain road, about the orange prescription bottle being the thing he'd grabbed, the single object he'd saved from a burning building because it was the most essential, because her heart was the most essential, because everything else could go. Yes, he said. It came out quietly. I can accept that. Jack nodded once. Outside, Hector was not only looking at the engine. Thomas didn't know this yet. He would find out later, piece by piece, in the way you find out about things that happened while you were sitting somewhere being taken care of. That Hector had looked at the engine and delivered his verdict to Jack in approximately 8 minutes, and that Jack had listened and then made a call on his phone, a call that lasted 4 minutes, and that within 90 minutes, a truck had arrived at the clubhouse with something in its bed that Thomas was not going to see until morning. He would find out. But right now, he was sitting across from Jack Morrison, and the room was quiet around Evelyn's sleep, and Danny was making small notations in his notebook, and somewhere outside the sound of tools on metal was a continuous presence at the edge of hearing that Thomas had stopped trying to interpret, and had simply let be what it was. A man named Ray brought coffee without being asked, set 2 cups on the table between Thomas and Jack, and moved away without comment. Thomas wrapped his hands around the cup and felt the warmth of it, and was aware distantly that he was doing what the human body does when it has been under sustained stress, and is finally imperfectly in a place where the immediate urgency has receded enough for the stress to start releasing itself from the muscles. He was shaking slightly, just slightly, hands and shoulders. Jack saw it and said nothing, which was the correct response, and Thomas was grateful for it. "You taught school," Jack said. A statement, not a question. He'd taken it from something Thomas had said earlier and filed it. 31 years. High school history. What period? 20th century mostly. American history. Some world history. He paused. What I liked best was the... He stopped. The sentence had started before he'd decided to start it, and where it was going was somewhere personal, somewhere he hadn't gone in a long time, because you don't talk about what you used to love. When you're surviving, talking about what you love is a luxury of stability. "What?" Jack said. Thomas looked at his coffee. "The moments when things could have gone differently," he said. "Historical turning points. The decisions that seemed small at the time and turned out to be..." He paused. "I used to tell my students that history is made of individual choices that felt ordinary to the person making them. Nobody thinks they're making history. They think they're making a decision about one specific thing on one specific day." Jack was quiet for a moment. "Like walking through a door," he said. Thomas looked at him. "Like walking through a door and asking one question," Jack said. He wasn't making a point of it. His voice was level factual, the tone of someone observing something true. Thomas looked at the door he had walked through. He thought about the moment in the car after the engine went quiet, when he had sat with his hands on the steering wheel and looked at Evelyn, and then looked at the building, and run every calculation his 78-year-old mind had available, and arrived at the conclusion that the calculation didn't matter, that Evelyn's breathing was more important than any calculation. One decision. One ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "Jack," he said. "Yeah. Why is the most feared biker in Montana running an operation that looks from the inside a lot like..." He stopped. Chose the word. "A family." The room was quiet enough that he heard Evelyn shift in her sleep, heard Danny make a small sound of notation, heard outside the steady work of tools. Jack looked at his coffee for a moment. When he looked up, something in his face was different. Not the calm competence Thomas had been reading since the man stood up from his table and walked across the room. Something underneath that. Older. "I was 12 years old," Jack said. His voice was the same volume, exactly the same. But Thomas heard it differently, the way you hear something differently when the register shifts below the surface level of the words. "My grandparents," Jack said. "My father's parents. They were..." He stopped. "They'd fallen on hard times. Not through any fault of their own. My grandfather had been a mill worker his whole life, and the mill closed and they lost almost everything. This was in the 80s. I was 12. He set his coffee cup down. They were sleeping in their car in a parking lot outside Missoula. Someone saw them. Saw an old man and an old woman in a car with everything they owned and decided that meant easy. His jaw was level. His voice was level. Everything was level, and Thomas understood that the levelness was the container, not the absence of what it was containing. 3 men. Took everything in the car. Hurt my grandfather badly enough that he was in the hospital for 2 weeks. He paused. 9 people walked through that parking lot while it was happening. 9 people who saw and kept walking. Thomas held very still. My grandfather never fully... Jack stopped. Started again differently. He was never exactly the same after. Not just the physical. Something in him that had a certain belief he'd had about the world it didn't come back. He picked up the coffee cup, set it down again. "I was 12, he said, "and I made myself one promise." He looked at Thomas directly, the full present alert look that Thomas had registered from the first moment. "I promised that as long as I had breath, no elderly person would ever stand alone in front of me again. Not if I could help it. Not if I was in the room. Not if I was anywhere nearby and had legs to move." The room was very quiet. Thomas Walker sat across from Jack Morrison and felt the specific weight of a story that explained everything. Not just tonight, not just the car and the food and Danny's notebook and Hector's work outside, but the entire architecture of what he'd been observing for the last 2 hours. The thing that had made the room feel the way it felt, the way a family feels, when it has built its identity around something true and has been building it for a long time. "How old are you now?" Thomas said. His voice was careful. 58, Jack said. 46 years, Thomas said. 46 years, Jack said. Outside, Hector called something to another man, his voice carrying a specific note, not alarm, something else. The note of someone who has found what he was looking for and is beginning to understand the full scope of the work. Thomas heard it and didn't ask. He looked at his wife sleeping in a chair that someone had made comfortable for her, in a room that someone had made cool for her, monitored by a man who had spent 8 years learning how to keep people alive and had never stopped applying that knowledge, regardless of what his vest said about who he was. He thought about 9 people walking through a parking lot in Missoula in the 80s, looking at an old man being hurt and keeping walking. He thought about the specific weight of that, the specific inheritance of it, the thing a 12-year-old boy carries from a parking lot in Missoula into the next 46 years of his life, and builds into something, builds deliberately and specifically, and with full intention into something that means no elderly person stands alone. "Jack," he said. "Yeah. I'm sorry about your grandfather." Jack looked at him. "I'm sorry 9 people walked past," Thomas said. "I'm sorry there wasn't someone in that parking lot who—" He stopped. "I'm sorry you were 12 years old and had to learn that lesson instead of a different one." Jack was very still. "That's the first time," he said slowly, "that anyone has ever said that to me." He paused. "The first time anyone has apologized for the people who walked past." Thomas hadn't planned it. He had no strategy for this conversation. He'd had no strategy for this entire evening, had been improvising from the moment the engine went quiet. But he had been a history teacher for 31 years, and what history had taught him underneath all the turning points and individual choices and decisions that seemed ordinary was that the thing people most needed to hear was rarely the thing they were asked about. Jack looked at the table. Then he looked up. "Get some rest tonight," he said. His voice was back to its working register, not closed off, not retreated, but returned to the functional calm of someone who has visited somewhere and come back. "There's a room in the back. Bed bathroom cool enough. You and Evelyn use it tonight." Thomas opened his mouth. "Don't," Jack said quietly. "Just say thank you and go rest." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. Jack nodded. He stood and moved toward the door. And Thomas watched him go. And he thought about 46 years of a promise made by a 12-year-old boy in the aftermath of a parking lot in Missoula. And he thought about how the things that break us sometimes, if we're very specific about what we do with the breaking, become the exact shape of something that holds other people up. Evelyn stirred. "Thomas?" she said without fully opening her eyes. "Right here," he said. "Are we all right?" He looked around the room. At Danny and his notebook. At the men at the tables who had in the last 2 hours never once made him feel like he was somewhere he didn't belong. At the door, Jack Morrison had just walked through. At the window beyond which Hector was still working on their car in the dark. "Yeah," Thomas said. "We're all right." She settled back into sleep. He sat beside her and held her hand, and he did not cry, because he had cried twice in the last 7 months, and both times it had been alone in the car after she was asleep. And that was where he put those things in the privacy of a parked car and his wife's sleeping face, and he was not alone in a parked car right now. He was somewhere entirely different. And the car outside was being worked on by a man whose father had run a garage in Tucson for 40 years, and the sound of that work was the last thing Thomas Walker heard before exhaustion. The real kind, the bone-level kind, that 7 months of handling things alone had accumulated, finally fully pulled him under. Thomas woke before Evelyn. He always had. 53 years of marriage, and he had never once slept later than her, not even in the years when they'd stayed up late for reasons worth staying up for. The early years, the young years, the years before the mortgage and the medical bills and the orange prescription bottle became the organizing facts of their life together. His body simply did not sleep past a certain point, had never been convinced that the world could be trusted to run itself past 6 a.m. without his participation. He lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar room and let himself understand where he was. The back room of the clubhouse was spare but clean. A real bed, a real pillow, a bathroom with hot water temperature cool enough that he had pulled the blanket up sometime in the night without remembering doing it. Evelyn was beside him, her breathing the slow, even rhythm of genuine sleep, the kind she hadn't managed in weeks without waking 2 or 3 times to shift position, because the station wagon's back seat had never been designed for anyone to sleep in full horizontal extension for 7 months running. He watched her breathe for a moment. Then he got up carefully, the way you get up at 78 when you've slept on a real mattress after months of not doing so, and your body has opinions about the transition. And he dressed quietly and went out into the main room. It was just past 6. The room was not empty. 2 men were at the far table with coffee, a third was near the door with a phone, all of them in the worn and easy posture of people who had been up for a while and were in no hurry about it. They acknowledged Thomas with nods that were genuine, without being elaborate, the nod of people who have accepted your presence and don't need to make an event of it. He looked for Jack. Jack was outside. Thomas found him in the lot standing beside the station wagon with Hector, both of them looking at something under the hood, speaking in the low technical shorthand of 2 people who share a language Thomas didn't have. Jack had a coffee cup in his right hand. He hadn't shaved. He looked in the early morning like a man who had either not slept or had slept very little and was functioning at full capacity, regardless which Thomas recognized as the signature of a particular kind of person, someone whose relationship with rest was pragmatic rather than indulgent. He heard Thomas approach and turned. "Morning," Jack said. "Morning." Thomas looked at the car, at the open hood, at Hector who was doing something with his hands in the engine that had the focused economy of someone who had done this particular motion 10,000 times. "How bad is it?" Jack looked at Hector. Hector looked at Thomas. He was maybe 45, compact and precise in his movements, with hands that were permanently stained in the way of someone who had made peace with the fact that engines left marks. "The engine I already told Jack about," he said directly. "That's the headline, but there's more." "Tell me," Thomas said. Hector told him. He told him about the transmission fluid that had been low for long enough to cause damage that was functional but degrading. He told him about the brake pads that were at 12%, which was a number that should have been addressed 2,000 miles ago. He told him about the air conditioning compressor that had been running on borrowed time and had picked the wrong month to begin its final failure. He told him about the tire on the rear left that had a slow leak in the sidewall that no amount of inflation was going to permanently resolve. He told him all of it with the straightforwardness of a mechanic who has decided that the most useful thing he can do for a person is give them the complete truth, and Thomas listened to all of it with the specific quality of attention he had given to difficult information for 7 months. The attention of someone who has practiced receiving bad news without collapsing under it. When Hector finished, Thomas nodded. "What's the bottom line?" he said. "The car needs more than it's worth," Hector said simply. Thomas looked at the station wagon. He had bought it 9 months ago for $4,000 from a private seller in Billings who had been honest about its age and optimistic about its condition, and had turned out to be correct about the former and incorrect about the latter. It had been the vehicle that carried them out of their apartment parking lot the day after the insurance check cleared. It had been their shelter and their transportation and their primary address for 7 months. He didn't feel sentimentality about objects. He'd lost too many to afford sentimentality. But he felt the weight of what Hector had just told him, the way you feel the weight of a door closing. Not grief exactly, but the finality of it, the sound of a thing ending. "All right," he said. "Thomas." Jack's voice. He looked at him. "Something arrived last night," Jack said, "after you were asleep." Thomas waited. "A truck came from a member of ours in Missoula. He runs a lot used vehicles, fleet vehicles. Jack called him last night after Hector gave me the full picture." He paused. "There's a 2019 Subaru Outback in the lot. Clean title. Under 60,000 miles. Full service history. The AC works." Thomas stared at him. "Jack, it's not charity," Jack said with the same quiet finality he'd used the night before, the phrasing of someone who has thought about the distinction and means it precisely. "Our member donated it. He donates a vehicle once a year to someone who needs it. Usually goes through a veterans organization." A pause. "This year, it's going to you and Evelyn." Thomas opened his mouth. He had a response prepared. He had several, actually the full architecture of refusal that he'd been building for 7 months against exactly this kind of offer, the responses that maintained the structure of self-sufficiency, that kept the accounting clean, that didn't leave him owing something he couldn't repay. He looked at the station wagon. He thought about the brake pads at 12%, about Evelyn in the heat, about the tire with the slow leak in the sidewall that he had been inflating every 3 days for the last month, stopping at gas stations and using the free air, doing the math about how long it had left. He thought about Evelyn's breathing on the drive yesterday, about the color of her face against the window. The responses dissolved. "I don't know what to say," he said. His voice came out with something in it he hadn't invited. "You don't have to say anything," Jack said. "Hector's going to go over the whole vehicle with you this morning, show you everything, answer every question. It's yours to understand completely before you take it." Thomas looked at Hector. Hector nodded once, matter of fact. The nod of a man who had already accepted this as his morning's work and was at peace with that. Thomas looked at the ground for a moment. He was doing the thing he did when something was too large to process immediately. Going very still. Letting the fact of it sit, without trying to immediately organize it into something manageable. He had learned this late. This particular skill had spent most of his life as a man who organized everything immediately, who could not let information sit unprocessed, who had to know exactly where everything went in the structure before he could function. 7 months of not being able to control what happened next had taught him painfully and incrementally that some things could not be immediately organized, and that the attempt to do so was more exhausting than allowing the stillness. He stood in the lot in the early morning of a Tuesday in Montana, and he let the fact of a 2019 Subaru Outback with a clean title sit in him without organizing it. Then, Evelyn's voice came from the doorway of the clubhouse. "Thomas." He turned. She was standing in the doorway, in the clothes she'd slept in, her silver hair uncharacteristically loose around her face, and she was looking at something to the left of the building's entrance with an expression he couldn't read from this distance. He crossed to her quickly, the instinctive speed of a man for whom his wife's unexplained expression at 6 in the morning warranted rapid response. He reached her. He looked at what she was looking at. 3 men had arrived at the edge of the lot, not members. Thomas read this immediately in the way he had learned to read a room since yesterday. These were not the organized, purposeful bearing of the men inside. These were something different. Younger, though not by as much as he'd first thought, mid-30s maybe. The particular looseness of people who had organized themselves into a unit based on shared willingness to do things that other people wouldn't. They had seen the station wagon yesterday was what Thomas didn't know yet. Had seen an elderly couple in a broken-down vehicle and had noted the location and come back in the morning with the specific calculation of people who preyed on circumstances they recognized. The one in front was looking at Evelyn, looking at her the way Thomas had not had someone look at his wife in their presence for a very long time, with the flat evaluating look of someone who has decided that another person is an object whose value is what can be taken from them. "Well, look at this," the man said. His voice was easy, almost pleasant. That was the worst part of it. The pleasantness, the performance of casualness that barely contained the intention underneath. "These your folks' cars." Thomas stepped forward, fully in front of Evelyn. He didn't think about it. 53 years, and the motion was below thought. "Can I help you?" he said. He kept his voice level, the same level he'd maintained through 7 months of difficult conversations, just looking around. The man in front took a step closer. His two companions spread slightly in the way that people spread when they've done this before and know what position gives them the options they want. "Nice morning. Lot of nice stuff out here." "This is private property," Thomas said. "Is it?" The man looked around with an exaggerated assessment. "I don't see any signs." "You should leave," Thomas said. The man looked at him. At 78-year-old Thomas Walker in yesterday's clothes, with his hands loose at his sides, and his body squarely between this man and his wife, and he smiled the smile of someone who has done the calculation and found it entirely in his favor and is mildly entertained by the obstacle. "Old man," he said, "you really don't want to." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't finish it because Jack Morrison had come through the clubhouse door. Thomas heard the door and felt rather than saw the quality of the air in the lot change, the specific atmospheric shift that happens when a room's center of gravity relocates. He didn't take his eyes off the man in front of him, but he heard Jack's footsteps on the gravel, and he heard behind Jack the sound of more footsteps, and then more, and the sound kept coming. The man in front of Thomas was watching something over Thomas's shoulder. His smile was gone. Whatever he was seeing over Thomas's shoulder was doing the work that the smile had been covering, the work of calculating odds, of measuring what he'd walked into against what he'd expected to walk into, of performing in real time the assessment that should have been performed before he arrived. Thomas heard Jack stop somewhere just behind and to his left. Jack did not raise his voice. "You came to the wrong lot," Jack said. The three men were looking at what was behind Thomas now. Thomas, for just a moment, turned to look too. The doorway and the area around the clubhouse held every member who had been inside. 37 men, he would learn later. Not moving, not speaking, not making any gesture that could be characterized as threat. Simply there in the specific fullness of people who have made a collective decision and are communicating it through the fact of their presence rather than anything additional. No shouting. No weapons, no performance. Just 37 men standing still. The man in front, who had been easy and pleasant and amused 30 seconds ago, was none of those things now. He was doing what all calculation does when the numbers change, dramatically revising. Fast. "We're just," he started. "You're leaving," Jack said. Not loudly. Not as a threat. Not in the way of someone who needs the other person to understand the consequences of refusal. Simply as a statement of the next thing that was going to happen, delivered in the register of someone for whom the outcome was not genuinely in question. The man looked at Jack. Jack looked back at him with the full, present, alert eyes that Thomas had registered from the first moment, the eyes that were not performing anything, that were simply there in the specific weight of someone who has been in rooms like this before and knows exactly what this room is. The man in front looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back at him from in front of his wife, and he didn't move. The man looked at the 37 men standing still. He made his decision. He turned and walked back toward the road, and his two companions went with him, and the leaving had no residual bravado in it, no parting comment, no gesture, no backward glance designed to suggest the departure was voluntary. It was simply people who had arrived with intention and were leaving without it, the motion of a calculation that had fully revised itself. They were gone in under a minute. The 37 men behind Thomas remained where they were for a moment longer, the collective equivalent of making sure, and then one by one began moving back inside, back toward coffee and conversation with the unhurried ease of a group that had done something entirely routine. Thomas stood where he was. He became aware after a moment of Evelyn's hand on his arm. She had come around from behind him, and her hand was on his arm, and he looked at her, and her face had the expression he could read better than any document. The expression that said she was not going to say what she was feeling, because what she was feeling was too large for the morning, and they both knew it, and the knowing was sufficient. He put his hand over hers. Jack came around to face him. "You all right?" Jack said. "Fine," Thomas said. Then, because Jack had established a precedent for honesty that Thomas found he didn't want to violate, "My hands are shaking." "That's normal," Jack said. "That's your body processing something it didn't want to have to process." He looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Walker, are you all right?" Evelyn looked at him with the specific look she reserved for questions about her well-being that she found redundant. "I'm fine, Jack," she said. "I've been fine. I was fine watching my husband stand in front of 3 men because the thought of stepping back apparently doesn't exist in his vocabulary." "Evie, don't Evie me." Her voice had the quality he recognized, not anger, something fiercer and more specific. "You're 78 years old, Thomas." "I'm aware of my age. Those men were... I know what they were." "Then you know you shouldn't have Evie." His voice was quiet. "I know. I also know I've spent 53 years putting myself between you and things. I'm not going to stop because of a number." She looked at him. The look lasted 4 seconds and contained, as their looks frequently contained, an entire conversation that would have taken other people 20 minutes. "Impossible, man," she said finally. Her voice had shifted, the edge of it softened by something that wasn't softness exactly, but lived in the same neighborhood. "You knew that when you framed the jersey," he said. Her expression moved in the direction of a smile before she controlled it. She looked at Jack. "Was anyone going to help him, or were you all just going to watch?" "We were approximately 4 seconds behind, ma'am," Jack said with a gravity that was entirely sincere and also contained something that might have been in a different register humor. Evelyn looked at him. "Jack," she said. "Mrs. Walker, thank you." She said it the way she said things that mattered directly, without preamble, without the softening that would have reduced its weight. "Not just for this morning. For last night. For all of it." She paused. "Thomas told me before we slept. About your grandfather. About the promise you made." Jack was very still. "I want you to know," Evelyn said, "that your grandfather would be proud of what the promise became." She paused. "Not of what happened to him. Of what you did with what happened to him." The lot was quiet. Jack Morrison, who Thomas had now watched move through approximately 18 hours of crisis management, with the unshakable competence of someone who had decided long ago what he was, and had never revisited the decision. Jack Morrison stood in a parking lot in the early morning and received this from a 76-year-old woman with silver hair and a heart condition and yesterday's clothes, and something in his face did a thing that Thomas suspected it didn't do very often. It opened, not dramatically. Not visibly enough that anyone who didn't know how to read faces would have caught it. Just the specific small opening that happens when something lands in a place that has been waiting for it, and the waiting has been long enough that the landing is felt in the full depth of the waiting. "Thank you, Mrs. Walker," Jack said. His voice was exactly level. "Exactly." She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has said what she meant and considers the matter addressed. Then she looked at Thomas. "Is there coffee?" "Inside," Thomas said. "Then let's go inside," she said. "And you can tell me about this car situation you apparently handled while I was sleeping." She walked toward the door and Thomas fell in beside her, and he held the door, and she went through it, and he followed, and Jack came behind them. And the morning, which had contained in the space of 45 minutes more than most mornings accumulated in a year, settled into the particular quiet that follows resolution. Inside, Pete was behind the bar with coffee, and the professional indifference of a man who had seen enough mornings in this room to have stopped ranking them. He poured without being asked. Evelyn sat at the table and wrapped her hands around the cup, and Thomas sat beside her, and they were quiet for a moment, in the way of people who have been through something together and are still inside the processing of it. "The car," Evelyn said finally. "Needs more than it's worth," Thomas said. "I heard that part through the window." She looked at him. "And the other part?" "The Subaru." Thomas looked at her. "I have functioning ears, Thomas. I also have functioning eyes. I can see what these men are." She paused. "Not what people think they are, what they actually are." She wrapped her hands tighter around the cup. "I was wrong," she said simply, "about what I thought I knew." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "So was I," he said. She looked at him with 53 years in it. "You figured it out faster." "I had to," he said. "You were asleep." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. Her chest was still doing the thing that had prompted Danny to take out the notebook, but close enough that Thomas heard it and felt something ease in him that had been taught since yesterday afternoon. Danny appeared at Evelyn's elbow. He sat and took her blood pressure without ceremony, in the now familiar rhythm of a man who has incorporated this into the morning structure. He read the number. He wrote it down. "Better," he said. "Significantly better than last night." He looked at her. "How's the chest heaviness?" "2," she said. "Maybe less than 2. He nodded, wrote it, looked at Thomas. "She needs to see her regular cardiologist this week. Not as an emergency, but as a follow-up. Whatever she's managing yesterday pushed it harder than it should be pushed." He paused. "I can write a summary of what I observed last night and this morning to give to her doctor, if that's useful." Thomas looked at him. "You would do that," he said. "I already started it," Danny said. He held up the notebook. "I'll type it up before you leave." Thomas looked at the notebook, at the small, precise handwriting visible at the edge of the pages, at this man who had spent his morning monitoring his wife's cardiac function and was now offering to write a medical summary for a doctor he would never meet for a couple he had known for less than 24 hours. He looked at Jack, who was at the bar with his coffee talking to a member Thomas didn't know the name of yet, occupying his space in the room with the same ease he occupied all spaces. He looked around the room. At Pete, at Ray, at the members moving through the morning with the unself-conscious purpose of people who know who they are and have no remaining uncertainty about it. He thought about 9 people walking past a parking lot in Missoula. He thought about the specific weight of that. The specific absence of it, of people who see and keep moving, who calculate the cost and decide it's not theirs to pay. He thought about what a 12-year-old boy did with that absence over the following 46 years. He thought about what it built. Outside the window through the glass, he could see the 2019 Subaru Outback in the corner of the lot where Hector had left it. He could see the morning light on its windshield. He could see Hector moving toward it with a clipboard ready to walk Thomas through every system, every detail, everything he needed to know before he drove away in it. He looked at Evelyn. She was looking at him with the look that needed no translation. "We're going to be okay," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Thomas said. He said it the way he had learned to say things that were true, not because they were inevitable, not because the road ahead was clear, but because the word was accurate in this moment, in this room, in the specific context of what surrounded them. They were going to be okay. The morning moved around them and the coffee was hot, and Danny's handwriting moved across the notebook page, and outside, Hector was ready with the clipboard, and somewhere at the edge of everything, the weight that Thomas Walker had been carrying alone for 7 months had become, without his quite knowing the moment it happened, something that was being carried differently. Not by him alone, by something larger, and that in the specific arithmetic of a man who had spent his whole life handling things himself, was the most significant number he had ever encountered. Hector walked Thomas through the Subaru for 45 minutes. Every system, every indicator, every switch and dial and compartment, the location of the spare tire, the way the seat adjusted the specific sound the engine made when it was running correctly so that Thomas would know immediately if it was ever running incorrectly. He explained the service history page by page, pointing at dates and mileage numbers with the patience of a teacher, which was Thomas thought exactly what he was being in the specific domain where his knowledge was deepest. Thomas asked questions. Real ones, not the polite engagement of someone going through the motions of a transaction. He had been a teacher long enough to know the difference between a question asked to fill silence and a question asked to understand, and he asked the kind that were meant to leave him knowing. Evelyn stood beside them for the first 15 minutes, then went back inside when Danny appeared at the door and gestured that he'd finished typing the medical summary and wanted to go over it with her before they left. She went without argument, which told Thomas everything he needed to know about how she was feeling. The Evelyn of full health argued with medical professionals as a baseline posture. The Evelyn who was still managing the morning's residual effects went along because she was a practical woman who understood when cooperation served her better than resistance. When Hector finished, he handed Thomas the keys. Just placed them in his palm. The simple physical act of it, the small weight of the key fob, landed in Thomas's hand with a gravity that had nothing to do with its actual mass. "Any questions come up on the road," Hector said. "You call me." He had already written his number in Thomas's phone, had taken the old flip phone from Thomas's pocket with practiced efficiency, and entered the number himself, because watching Thomas navigate the contacts menu would have taken longer than they had morning for. "Thank you, Hector," Thomas said. Hector nodded in the way of men who receive thanks by acknowledging it and moving on, who do not need gratitude to linger in order for it to count. Thomas stood beside the Subaru with the keys in his hand, and he looked at the station wagon across the lot. He had been thinking about what to do with the station wagon since Hector's assessment that morning, running the options with the habitual efficiency of a man who had been running resource calculations for 7 months. The vehicle had no trade-in value in any practical sense. It was an object that had served its purpose and exceeded that purpose by several months and was done. He had thought he would feel more about it. He didn't feel very much. What he felt mostly was the weight of the keys in his palm and the clean title in his shirt pocket and the service history in the glove compartment and the fact that the air conditioning worked. Jack appeared beside him. "We'll handle the station wagon," Jack said. "Hector knows a salvage contact. It'll get documented and disposed of properly. I should—" Thomas. The same quiet finality. "It's handled. Let it be handled." Thomas looked at him. He was getting better at this, at the specific skill of allowing things to be handled, of not insisting that his fingerprints be on every outcome, of recognizing that the need to personally manage everything was not always strength, and was sometimes simply the refusal to let anyone in. He had been building this skill since yesterday afternoon, and he was not yet good at it, but he was better than he'd been, which was the only measure that mattered. "All right," he said. Jack looked at him steadily. "Before you go," he said, "there's something I want to talk to you about." Thomas waited. "Come inside." They went inside. Evelyn was at the table with Danny's typed summary in her hands, reading it with the focused attention she gave things she intended to fully understand. She looked up when they came in, read Jack's expression and Thomas's, and looked back at the summary with the specific decision to give them space, the practiced discretion of a woman who knew which conversations she was needed in immediately and which ones could wait 4 minutes. Jack sat across from Thomas. He had his phone on the table. He set it there with the deliberateness of someone who is about to use it as part of a conversation. "I made some calls last night," Jack said. "After we slept," Thomas said. "After you slept. I don't sleep much." He said it without complaint or invitation for sympathy, just fact. "I called a contact at a veterans organization in Missoula, Marcus, the one who helped with Evelyn yesterday. He connected me. Your service record, Thomas. You were Army, 1968 to 1970. Thomas was very still. "How did you—" "Marcus looked you up. Standard procedure for us when we're trying to connect someone with resources. Veterans have access to things that other people don't, and making sure those things are accessed correctly matters." He paused. "You never applied for VA housing assistance." "I didn't think I qualified," Thomas said. "It's been 50 years since I served. I thought—" "You qualified?" Jack said. "Have qualified for the last 20 years. The medical debt situation, the loss of primary residence, there are programs you should have been in, Thomas. The system failed to reach you, which happens more than it should, but the eligibility is there. Thomas sat with this for a moment. He thought about the 7 months. About the parking lots and the cash motels and the gas station restrooms. He thought about the precise and detailed system he had constructed for surviving without assistance. The system he had built and maintained, and been privately proud of in the way that you can be privately proud of a thing, even when the thing is proof of a catastrophe. He thought about 50 years of eligibility that had never been connected to him, because the system that was supposed to make that connection had too many gaps and too many overwhelmed people working inside it, and not enough of the specific thing that Jack Morrison had, which was the will and the organization and the network to make the call at 11 p.m. and have an answer by morning. "There's a complex," Jack said. He pulled up something on his phone, turned it to show Thomas. "Senior housing, income-based, subsidized, 2 miles from a medical center, which matters for Evelyn's cardiac follow-ups." He paused. "There's a 2-bedroom unit available. It opened up 3 weeks ago. My contact put your name on it this morning. It'll hold for 10 days while the paperwork processes." Thomas looked at the phone, at the building on the screen, at the address in Missoula. He looked at Jack. "There will be paperwork," Jack said. "A lot of it. Government programs always have a lot of it. Margaret. She's a retired social worker who volunteers with us on exactly this kind of case. She'll sit with you and walk through every form. Every form." He said it with the emphasis of someone who means it literally. "You won't do any of it alone." Thomas thought about the social worker in Billings, the one who had been genuinely sympathetic and genuinely overwhelmed. The 40-minute phone calls that accomplished nothing. The letters he'd drafted and redrafted. He thought about Margaret, a retired social worker who volunteered with a Hells Angels chapter in Montana, because apparently that was something that existed in the world, and he thought about what it meant that the most efficient social service operation he had encountered in 7 months was being run out of a motorcycle clubhouse. "Jack," he said. "Yeah. I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Why are you spending this much time on 2 people you met yesterday?" Jack looked at him. He didn't answer immediately. Not the pause of someone caught off guard, but the pause of someone giving the question the weight it deserved. "Because you walked through a door," he said, "and because the people who walked past my grandfather's parking lot in 1982 each thought someone else would handle it." He put the phone back in his pocket. "I've found that things don't get handled unless someone handles them. And I've found that I'm good at handling things." He paused. "So I do." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "That's the whole answer," he said. "That's the whole answer." Evelyn looked up from Danny's summary. Thomas and Jack both looked at her. "I read this twice," she said, holding up the summary. She looked at Danny, who was refilling his coffee at the bar. "Daniel." "Ma'am." "You were thorough." "I tried to be." "You were thorough," she said again with a weight in it that made the repetition into something different from the first time, not redundancy emphasis. "My cardiologist in Billings, we lost that relationship when we lost the apartment address, and our insurance lapsed. I've been managing on what I had. The remaining prescription." She set the summary down. "I know what this paper means in a doctor's hands." "It means context," Danny said. "So whoever sees you next isn't starting from zero." "It means more than that," Evelyn said. "But thank you for the summary." Danny raised his coffee cup in a small acknowledgement and returned to his conversation at the bar. Evelyn looked at Jack. "The housing," she said. Jack looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Evelyn. "You heard." "I told you. Functioning ears." She looked at Jack. "The paperwork timeline. How realistic is 10 days? With Margaret helping, very realistic. She's done it before several times. She knows which offices to call, which forms can be submitted digitally, which in-person visits are actually required, versus which ones can be handled with a phone call from someone who knows the right name to ask for." He paused. "She's good." "She's a volunteer," Evelyn said, "not a question." "She is. Why does she volunteer with—" Evelyn stopped, chose her words. With your organization. Jack was quiet for a moment. Her husband was a member, he said. Passed 4 years ago. She stayed because she said it was the most useful thing she did with her time. He paused. Her words. Evelyn absorbed this. She had been doing what Thomas recognized as her version of his processing, the deliberate sequential integration of information that she preferred to do internally before she spoke, which had made her an exceptional listener over 53 years, and had also occasionally driven Thomas to distraction in moments when he wanted her reaction faster than she was willing to give it. All right, she said. She looked at Thomas. All right. All right what? Thomas said. All right, we should stay until the paperwork is started at minimum. She looked at Jack. If that's acceptable. There's a room, Jack said. As long as you need it. She nodded. The nod of a woman who has made a decision and considers it made. Thomas looked at her, then at Jack, then at the room around them, at Pete behind the bar, at the members who had been in and out all morning at the table where he and Evelyn had eaten dinner the night before, at the door he had walked through with shaking hands, and a question that had felt in the moment he asked it like the most frightening thing he had done in years. Margaret arrived at 10:30. She was 62, compact and precise in the way of someone who had spent a career navigating systems designed to be difficult to navigate and had developed a professional efficiency that bordered on formidable. She shook Thomas's hand, and Evelyn's hand with equal firmness set a manila folder and a legal pad on the table, and looked at them both with the direct assessment of someone who needed accurate information quickly. Tell me everything, she said. In order. Don't skip anything because you think it might not be relevant. Let me decide what's relevant. They told her everything. Thomas led and Evelyn filled gaps and corrected sequences where Thomas's memory had smoothed over a detail that Evelyn's had preserved exactly. Margaret wrote on the legal pad in a shorthand that Thomas couldn't read, but that covered 3 pages by the time they finished. She looked at the pages, made a small sound that was not distress but was assessment. The VA eligibility is solid, she said. That's the anchor. Everything else builds on it. She looked at Evelyn. The medical situation, the lapsed insurance that needs to be addressed in parallel with the housing, not sequentially. There's a program through the VA Medical Center in Missoula that covers cardiac care for veterans' spouses. You qualify. She paused. You've been managing without your full prescription for how long? Evelyn looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the table. 6 weeks, Evelyn said. The cost we had to... I know, Margaret said with the practiced non-judgment of someone who had heard this sentence complete itself many different ways and had long since stopped needing to hear the ending. We'll address the prescription situation today. I have a contact at the VA pharmacy liaison. It won't be today, but it'll be this week. She made a note. What you've been managing with a partial prescription and yesterday's heat, Danny's summary actually captures exactly what I needed to make the medical case. She looked toward the bar. Danny. Already planned on it, Danny said without turning around. Margaret looked back at her legal pad. Okay, she said. Here's what the next 10 days look like. She told them. She told them in the specific sequential timeline organized way of someone who has walked people through this process enough times to have mapped every obstacle and planned around everyone. She told them which forms were being submitted digitally today, which offices she was calling this afternoon, which in-person appointment was necessary, and when it was scheduled, what documents they needed to bring, and where those documents were obtainable in cases where the originals had been destroyed in a fire. She told them all of it, and Thomas listened to every word. And somewhere around the middle of it, he became aware that he was breathing differently than he had been. Not shallowly fully, the way you breathe when the chest that has been compressed by the weight of managing everything alone discovers that the weight has been redistributed. He looked at Evelyn during one of Margaret's pauses. Evelyn was looking at the legal pad. Her expression was the one he knew as her serious listening expression, the one that meant she was storing everything that she would be able to recite the timeline back in order if asked. But in the edges of it, the small muscles around her eyes and mouth that she had never fully learned to control, that she'd once told him were the part of her face that belonged more to her body than her mind. In those edges, he could read something else. Relief. The specific quality of it that comes not from a problem being solved, but from the discovery that you are not required to solve it alone. He looked away before she could catch him reading her and object to being read. The afternoon brought Jack's call to the Veterans Organization, which brought a follow-up call from a coordinator named Ellen who spoke to Thomas for 20 minutes and used words like enrolled and confirmed, and your file is active, that Thomas had never expected to hear in relation to his own situation. It brought a call from the housing complex in Missoula. A property manager named Gil, who had apparently received a call from someone that morning and had been expecting Thomas's call, and who walked him through the unit with the brisk professionalism of someone who understood that when Jack Morrison's contacts called, things moved. 2 bedrooms, ground floor, which mattered for Evelyn's cardiac situation. In-unit laundry. 3 blocks from a bus line that ran to the VA medical center. Thomas sat with the phone in his hand after he hung up. He sat with it long enough that Evelyn came and sat beside him and didn't say anything. Just sat, which was the right thing. Which was the thing she almost always did that was the right thing. "It's real," he said finally. "I know," she said. "Evelyn." He looked at her. "A week ago we were in a parking lot in Cascade County." "I know. And now there's a—" He stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. She knew where it was going, and he knew she knew. She took his hand. Not the way she'd taken it in the ambulance bay years ago, or the way she'd taken it in the hospital room after her first cardiac event. The emergency grip, the fear grip. The comfortable grip. The one that had been practiced so many thousands of times that it no longer required adjustment, that their hands fit together without negotiation. "Thomas," she said. "Yeah. Do you remember what you told your students about historical turning points?" He looked at her. "About how nobody thinks they're making history," she said. "About how they think they're just making one decision about one specific thing." "I remember. The decision to walk across that lot," she said. "To push open that door." He was quiet. "That was your turning point," she said. "And you made it." She paused. "I know it was terrifying. I was watching you from the car. Your back was straight the whole way. You didn't slow down once." She squeezed his hand. "I've been married to you for 53 years, and I want you to know that was one of the bravest things I've ever seen you do." Thomas Walker sat in a Hells Angels clubhouse in Montana, with his wife's hand in his, and felt the specific weight of 53 years of being known landing on top of everything else that had already landed today. And it was almost too much. It was almost more than the architecture could hold. And he breathed through it, the way he'd been breathing through difficult things his whole life, steadily. One breath at a time, not trying to resolve everything at once. "You would have done the same," he said. "I would have walked faster," she said. He laughed. It was the first time he had fully laughed in longer than he could immediately calculate, and it came from somewhere genuine and surprised both of them slightly with its completeness. Jack heard it from across the room and looked over, and whatever he saw on Thomas's face, the full laugh, the hand in hand, the 53 years of it, made him look back at whatever he was doing with the particular discretion of a man who understood the privacy of moments and respected it. At 4 p.m., Margaret packed up the legal pad. "I'll call you tomorrow with updates," she said. "The VA application will have a confirmation number by morning. Housing Gil is holding the unit, and given what we submitted this afternoon, my expectation is full approval within the week." She paused. "I want to say something." Thomas looked at her. In 22 years of doing this work, Margaret said, "I have processed a lot of cases, a lot of people in situations that the system was supposed to have caught before they got that far." She paused. "What Jack does, what all of them do, fills gaps that shouldn't exist. That's not a defense of the gaps. The gaps shouldn't be there, but they are, and the question is, who fills them?" She closed the manila folder. "I'm glad you walked through that door." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "So am I," he said. After Margaret left, Evelyn napped Danny's orders, and Evelyn complied because Danny had earned the authority by this point, and she recognized, earned authority, and honored it. Thomas sat with Jack at the table, and they drank coffee that was better than the morning's batch, and they talked in the way that men sometimes talk when the urgent things are handled and the remaining space can be filled with things that are real but not pressing. Jack talked about his grandfather again. Not the parking lot before that, the earlier part. The mill years. A man named Harold Morrison, who had worked the same floor of the same mill for 31 years, and had never once called in sick, and had never once asked for anything he hadn't earned, and who had been taken apart not by weakness, but by the specific American mechanism of a company deciding that its workers were a cost reduction opportunity. Thomas talked about teaching. About the students he remembered most, not the ones who had been easiest, or the ones who'd gone on to visible success, but the ones who had been most difficult to reach, who had sat in the back of his classroom with the expression of people who had already decided that whatever was being offered was not for them, and the specific satisfaction rarer than he'd wanted it to be of finding the thing that reached one of them. They talked for 2 hours. At 6, the members began arriving for the evening. Not all of them. The chapter was larger than what had been present yesterday, and not all of them had been at the clubhouse for the original arrival of the walkers. They came in ones and twos and small groups, and each one was told in passing in the organic way that information moves through a room that functions as a community, who the elderly couple at the table were, and how they had come to be there. Thomas watched it happen, the information moving the reactions to it, the small recalibrations of men who had heard the story and were deciding where it fit in their understanding of the world they occupied. A man named Bobby Large, quiet with a gray beard that had been growing since before Thomas's students were born, stopped at their table on his way to the bar. "My grandmother's 81, Bobby said without preamble. Lives alone in Helena. I drive up every 2 weeks to check on her." He paused. "My grandfather died in 2019. She didn't want to move." He looked at Thomas directly. "You tell me if there's anything I can do. I mean that. You have my number through Jack." He moved on before Thomas could formulate a complete response. 3 more men said similar things over the next hour, in the plain practical way of people whose offers were not performances, who were extending the actual thing rather than the symbolic gesture of it. Thomas took each one in, filed it, let it be what it was. At 7:30, Evelyn came back out from the room, rested, and with color that Danny confirmed was the best it had been since her arrival. She sat beside Thomas and ate dinner Pete had adjusted again for the sodium, and Evelyn noted this without making a project of it. Just thanked Pete directly and meant it, and she looked around the room with the particular attention of a woman who was updating her understanding of something she had previously categorized incorrectly. "I've been thinking," she said to Thomas quietly while the room moved around them. About what I thought I knew. Before yesterday." She looked at Jack across the room, at Bobby, at Pete, at Danny. "I built a picture. We both did. 50, 60 years of messages about what certain kinds of people meant, what they were capable of." She paused. "I was wrong." "We were wrong," Thomas said. "No," she said carefully. "I want to be specific. I was wrong about the category. I had put these men in a category that didn't leave room for this." She gestured in a way that meant the room the last 24 hours, all of it. "The category was wrong." She looked at him. "That's different from being wrong about everything. It means the category was the problem, not the people." Thomas looked at her. 53 years, and she still said things that made him look at her the way he had looked at her when she was 15 years old, and told him she didn't like football, which was the first time he had understood that he was going to spend his life trying to keep up with how she thought. "Yeah," he said. "The category was the problem." She nodded. She picked up her fork. Jack came by the table at 8 o'clock with his coffee and sat for a moment. "How are you feeling?" he asked Evelyn. "Better than yesterday," she said. "Better than I've felt in a while, honestly." She paused. "Danny says the rest helped." "Danny's usually right about that." She looked at Jack steadily. "The apartment in Missoula," she said. What about it? It's real. It's going to happen. It is. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, what do we do in return? I need to understand what this balance is. I don't do well without understanding what the balance is. Jack looked at her with something that was in its edges the shadow of a smile. Mrs. Walker, he said, I've learned something in a lot of years of doing this. The balance isn't between you and us. The balance is... He paused, choosing carefully. You will be somewhere someday, and you will see someone who needs what you can give them. And you'll give it. That's the balance. Evelyn looked at him. Pay it forward, Thomas said. If you want to call it that, Jack said. I've always just called it show up. When you can show up, show up. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, We taught school for 31 years. She looked at Thomas. Between us. She taught elementary, Thomas said. 2nd grade. Jack looked at Evelyn. 2nd grade, he said. There was something in his voice, not surprise but recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has just been given a piece of information that reframes something. What did you like best about it? Evelyn considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. The ones who came in already convinced they were bad at learning, she said. The ones who had been told somehow by someone or by something that school wasn't for them. She paused. I like to find the thing that proved them wrong. Jack Morrison looked at Evelyn Walker across a table in a Hells Angels clubhouse in Montana. And he nodded slowly, the nod of a man who recognizes something. Yeah, he said. Me too. The room was warm and the coffee was hot. And outside the Montana dark had settled completely, and Thomas Walker looked at his wife and then at the man across from them. And he thought about the specific arithmetic of things that found each other, the people and the moments and the decisions that seemed ordinary, that nobody thought were historical in the moment of making them. He thought about a door and a question and a woman who needed to rest. He thought about what had been on the other side of that door. He thought about what it meant that he had walked through it. He was still thinking about it when Evelyn took his hand under the table, the comfortable grip, the practiced one, the one that didn't need adjustment. He held it. The room moved around them warm and certain, and for the first time in 7 months, Thomas Walker sat somewhere and did not think about what came next. He just sat. He just was. And that, in the specific ledger of a man who had been keeping accounts for 7 months, was the most solvent he had felt in longer than he could count. They moved into the apartment on a Thursday, 8 days after Thomas Walker had pushed open a door with shaking hands, and asked one question. He and Evelyn carried the last box through the entrance of Unit 1C at the Pineview Senior Complex in Missoula, Montana, and stood together in a 2-bedroom apartment with in-unit laundry and ground-floor access, and 3 blocks to the bus line that ran to the VA Medical Center. They had almost nothing to carry. That was the fact that stopped Thomas in the doorway for a moment, the specific lightness of 2 people who had lost everything material and had been carrying only essentials for 7 months. 2 boxes. 1 bag of clothing. The orange prescription bottle, which now had a full refill in it, completed through the VA pharmacy liaison contact that Danny had confirmed would happen within a week, and that had happened in 4 days. A manila folder of documents that Margaret had organized with the precision of someone who understood that paper was the architecture of a legal existence and had made sure theirs was solid. That was it. That was all of it. Thomas stood in the doorway and looked at the empty rooms and felt the emptiness differently than he had expected to. He had thought it would feel like lack, the absence of the furniture and the photographs and the accumulated objects of a life lived in one place for 21 years. He had thought it would feel like grief, the specific grief of objects which he'd been told was lesser grief, but which was real nonetheless. It didn't feel like lack. It felt like space, like rooms that were waiting patiently and without judgment for whatever came next. Thomas, Evelyn said from behind him. He stepped inside. She came in after him. She walked through the living room and into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, empty clean, and closed it, and opened the window above the sink 2 inches to let in the July air, and stood there for a moment with both hands on the counter and her face toward the window. He watched her. He could not see her expression from this angle. He could only see her shoulders and the set of them and the particular quality of stillness she had when she was feeling something too large to speak immediately. "Evie," he said. "It smells like a real kitchen," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "I forgot what that was like." He crossed to her. He stood beside her at the counter. He didn't say anything. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. Evelyn cried about 4 times a decade, and this was apparently not one of those moments, but her face had the expression he knew as the aftermath of something releasing. The way a face looks when the body has been carrying something for a long time and has just set it down without fully announcing the setting down. "We're home," she said. The word landed in the empty kitchen and filled it. 2 syllables. The most weight Thomas had heard carried by 2 syllables in longer than he could immediately calculate. "Yeah," he said. "We are." She turned back to the window. He stood beside her, and they looked out at whatever was outside it, a parking lot, some trees. The ordinary Tuesday geography of a senior complex in Missoula, and neither of them said anything for a full minute, because the minute didn't require anything said inside it. The knock on the door came at noon. Thomas opened it. Jack Morrison was standing in the hallway with Bobby and Pete and a man named Garrett, who Thomas had met on the 3rd day at the clubhouse, and behind them, in a line that extended down the hallway to the stairwell and presumably beyond, were more members than Thomas could see from the doorway. Each one of them was carrying something. Bobby had a rolled rug under one arm. Pete had a lamp. Garrett had 2 dining chairs stacked with the focused balance of someone who had transported furniture before and had opinions about the correct method. Thomas stared. "You said you had nothing to furnish it with," Jack said. Not a question. He had asked this directly on day 2 with the practical inventory-taking manner of someone who needed accurate information. "I said we'd figure it out," Thomas said. "I was going to look at second-hand." "We figured it out for you," Jack said. He said it with the same quiet finality he applied to everything that had been decided and was not being revisited. "Can we come in?" Thomas stepped back. They came in. For the next 3 hours, Thomas Walker stood in the center of his new apartment and watched the most feared motorcycle club in Montana furnish it, not randomly. Not with the cheerful chaos of people who had arrived with good intentions and no plan. With the organized efficiency of people who had apparently discussed this in advance, who had assigned roles and knew what was going where, who communicated in the shorthand of men who worked together often enough to have developed a shared language for the task of getting things done. A bed frame and mattress. Good ones. Not cast-offs. The kind that suggested someone had made a phone call to a contact and the contact had come through. Appeared in the master bedroom with a headboard and a box spring and sheets that were still in packaging. A smaller bed for the second room, equally solid. A couch that was neither new nor old, but was exactly the color that Evelyn, shown a photograph on someone's phone at the clubhouse, had said was acceptable, which Thomas understood had been shown to her for this specific purpose. A kitchen table, 4 chairs, a standing lamp, a bookshelf that a man named Ray assembled from flat-pack components with the focused speed of someone who had done this before and had opinions about the correct sequence of steps. Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter and received all of it with a stillness that Thomas recognized as the stillness of someone who has reached the outer boundary of what they know how to process and is simply allowing it to pass through them rather than trying to organize it. At one point, Bobby set a rug in the living room and rolled it out and stood back to look at it, and Evelyn said from the kitchen, "2 inches to the left?" And Bobby moved it 2 inches to the left without comment, and the rug was better for it, and Bobby looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man who has just been given a piece of information that adjusted his assessment of someone and found the adjustment satisfactory. "Second-grade teachers," Bobby said. "We see everything." Evelyn confirmed. Bobby laughed. It was the genuine kind. Jack came to Thomas at the 2-hour mark. They stood in the hallway outside the unit, while a man Thomas had learned was named Curtis carried a reading lamp past them with the focused care of someone transporting something fragile. "How are you doing?" Jack said. "I don't have the right word for it," Thomas said honestly. You don't need one. Jack. Thomas looked at him. This is what you've done, what all of you have done. I don't know how to... He stopped. The sentence had too many possible endings, and none of them were complete. Thomas. Jack's voice was even. You know what I'm going to say. That I don't owe anything. That you don't owe anything. Jack confirmed. That's not performance. That's just true. Thomas looked at the apartment door open through which he could hear the sounds of his home being assembled by people who had met him 8 days ago. He thought about what that sentence meant, his home. He thought about when he had last been able to say that, and the answer was the morning he'd gotten the final paperwork from the bank in Billings, and the distance between that morning and this one contained 7 months that he did not want to live again, and that had nonetheless brought him here, to this hallway, to this door, to the man standing beside him. Can I ask you something? Thomas said. Yeah. The 12-year-old boy in the parking lot, Thomas said. The one who made the promise. If you could go back, if you could tell him something about where the promise was going to go, what would you say? Jack was quiet for a long moment. Thomas waited. He had learned in the last 8 days the shape of Jack's silences, which ones were processing, and which ones were managing, and which ones were the particular silence of someone going somewhere real. This was the third kind. I'd tell him, Jack said slowly, that what he was feeling. The anger, the helplessness, the need to do something with what he'd seen, that all of it was going to find a shape. He paused. I'd tell him that the shape was going to be larger than he could imagine, that the 9 people who walked past were going to become not an answer to, but a reason for something that would fill the gap they left. He paused again. And I'd tell him that it was going to be worth it. Every single part of it. He looked at Thomas. Every part. Thomas nodded. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. At 3:30, the last member left. The apartment was furnished. Not perfectly, not with the coordinated aesthetic of something deliberately designed, but with the particular rightness of a space that has been filled by people who cared more about the filling than the credit for it. The rug was 2 inches left of where Bobby had first put it. The reading lamp was exactly where Thomas would have put it, which he noted with a mild surprise. The bookshelf, empty now, stood against the wall with the patient readiness of something that was going to be used. Jack was the last one out. He shook Thomas's hand. He nodded to Evelyn. He was halfway down the hall when Evelyn said his name. He turned. She was standing in the doorway of the apartment, and she looked at him the way she had looked at things that mattered to her over 76 years, directly without mitigation, giving the thing her full attention. Jack, she said, I want you to come to Thanksgiving. He looked at her. Here, she said. This apartment, November. I am going to cook a full Thanksgiving dinner, and I want you and anyone you choose to bring to be at this table. She paused. That's not charity. That's not repayment. That's an invitation from people who want you in their home. Another pause. Do you understand the difference? Jack Morrison stood in a hallway in Missoula and looked at Evelyn Walker, and something in his face did the thing Thomas had seen it do exactly once before in the parking lot when Evelyn had told him his grandfather would be proud. It opened. Yes, ma'am, he said. I understand the difference. Good, she said. We'll expect you at 2. He left. Thomas and Evelyn stood in their apartment and listened to the hallway go quiet. Then Evelyn went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, still empty because furnishing was one thing and groceries were another, and there was still a list to be made, and closed it, and looked at Thomas with the expression that meant she was about to be practical. We need groceries, she said. I know, and I need to call Dr. Peterson's office and establish care with the VA cardiac team. She was already mentally organizing. He could see it happening. And we should write thank you notes, real ones, paper ones. To 47 people, Thomas said. To 47 people, she confirmed. 1 each, personal ones, not the same note 47 times. Thomas looked at her. Evelyn, he said, don't tell me it's too much. I wasn't going to. I was going to say we're going to need more paper. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded the decisive nod. Add it to the grocery list." He laughed. The laugh felt the way the first one had, complete, genuine, rising from somewhere that had been compressed for too long and was grateful for the space. She smiled. Not the almost smile she managed when she was maintaining composure. The real one, the one that reached her eyes and changed the whole construction of her face, the one he had been chasing since he was 17 years old and had never once taken for granted. "Welcome home, Thomas," she said. "Welcome home, Evie," he said. Thanksgiving came on the 28th of November. Evelyn started cooking the Tuesday before. She had a system. Had always had a system. 31 years of feeding a family on a teacher's salary had given her opinions about preparation timelines that she held with the conviction of someone who had tested the alternatives and found them wanting. She made the pie crusts on Tuesday, the stuffing base on Wednesday. Thursday she was in the kitchen from 6 a.m., and the apartment filled with a smell that Thomas hadn't encountered in over a year. The specific compound smell of a Thanksgiving being made from scratch by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He set the table. They had 10 place settings now. 8 Jack had arranged through a contact, 2 more. They'd bought themselves at a second-hand shop the week before, and Thomas set each one carefully, the way Evelyn had taught him to set a table in 1973 when they'd hosted their first Thanksgiving in the first house they'd owned, the one in Billings before the real one, the starter house with the furnace that made a sound no furnace should make, and the backyard that was somehow both too small and too much to manage. He set each plate down and thought about that backyard. He thought about the jersey in the attic. He thought about 47 thank you notes, handwritten, personal, delivered through Jack to the members who had furnished an apartment and checked a woman's blood pressure and typed a medical summary and driven from Missoula at midnight with a car on a truck bed. He thought about the responses to those notes, which had come back through Jack over 3 weeks in a variety of forms, some brief, some long, some from men who were clearly not accustomed to receiving handwritten correspondence and had responded with the particular sincerity of people for whom the gesture had landed unexpectedly deep. Bobby's had said, "My grandmother says thank you too. She doesn't know why. I told her someone reminded me to call more often." Danny's had said, "This is the best thank you note I've ever gotten, and I'm going to keep it. Take care of that heart." The one from the man named Curtis, who had carried the reading lamp with such careful attention, had said simply, "You're good people. Come back and visit." Thomas had read each response to Evelyn, and Evelyn had filed each one in a folder she had labeled in her schoolteacher handwriting, simply, "Them." The knock came at 1:58. Thomas opened the door. Jack was in the hallway with Bobby and Pete and Danny and Ray and Garrett and Curtis and 7 others Thomas recognized, and 2 he was meeting for the first time. Each of them was carrying something: casserole dishes covered with foil bottles of sparkling cider, a pie from someone's aunt in Helena that Jack mentioned had been described as the best apple pie in Cascade County by everyone who had eaten it, and flowers. Someone Thomas didn't see who had brought flowers. A large bunch of them, autumn colors, the kind of arrangement that suggested someone had thought about it rather than grabbing whatever was nearest to the register. "You're 2 minutes early," Evelyn called from the kitchen. "Should we come back?" Jack said. "Get in here," she said. They got in. The apartment that had been empty 8 weeks ago filled with people and noise and the smell of Thanksgiving cooking and the specific sound of a room discovering its own capacity for warmth. Thomas stood to the side for a moment and watched it happen the way a space changes when it's full of people who are genuinely glad to be in it, who are not performing gladness, but actually experiencing it, who have brought casserole dishes and an aunt's apple pie from Helena because they were invited somewhere and they knew how to show up. Danny went directly to Evelyn in the kitchen. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for 8 weeks. The medic's assessment, the quick inventory, and his expression said what it said when the numbers were good. "Color's excellent," he said. "Thank you, Daniel," she said. "Now make yourself useful and tell me if this gravy needs salt." He tasted it. "It doesn't." "I know," she said. "I wanted a second opinion." He laughed. Bobby found the bookshelf no longer empty, Filled now with the books Thomas had been acquiring from the library sale and the second-hand shop, the slow rebuilding of a reading life, and stood in front of it with the interest of someone who used books as a way of understanding people and was updating his understanding. History, he said. Mostly American. 31 years of teaching it, Thomas said. What period? 20th century. Bobby looked at the shelf for another moment. You have 3 books about the Pacific Theater. My father was at Iwo Jima, Thomas said. I've been trying to understand it since I was 12. Bobby turned. My grandfather was at Guadalcanal, he said. The information offered plainly one man to another, the quiet exchange of a shared inheritance of something large and difficult. They stood together at the bookshelf for a moment. You should come talk to our veterans group, Bobby said. We meet first Tuesday of the month. It's not formal. It's mostly just talking. Thomas looked at him. I'd like that, he said. Dinner was at 2:30. 11 people around a table designed for 8, which Evelyn had addressed by adding the folding card table Thomas had found at the second-hand shop, and covering it with a tablecloth that matched closely enough that only people looking for the mismatch would find it. And none of the people at this table were looking for mismatches. Jack sat to Thomas's left. Evelyn sat to Thomas's right. The rest arranged themselves in the way that people arrange themselves when there's no assigned seating and no agenda organically comfortably, the way water finds its level. Thomas stood to say grace. He was not a performatively religious man, had never been held his faith in the private way of someone for whom it was a personal architecture rather than a public declaration. He stood and looked at the table and looked at Evelyn and at Jack and at the faces he had come to know over 8 weeks and the 2 he was meeting today for the first time, and he said what was true. I was told once, he said, that history is made of individual choices that felt ordinary to the person making them. Nobody thinks they're making history. They think they're making a decision about one specific thing on one specific day. He paused. 8 weeks ago, I walked across a gravel lot and pushed open a door and asked one question. I thought I was making a decision about where my wife could rest for an hour. He looked at the table. I was wrong about what I was making. He looked at Jack. Thank you. For what you did with a promise a 12-year-old boy made in a parking lot 46 years ago. For what you built with it. For who you all are. He stopped. Amen. Amen, Evelyn said. The table said it after her. They ate. The food was extraordinary, which Thomas told Evelyn, and Evelyn accepted with the grace of someone who knows her cooking is good and does not require false modesty about it. The conversation was the kind that happens when people who are genuinely curious about each other discover they have time, that the meal is long, that nobody is looking at a phone, the kind that moves from one thing to another without effort, that doubles back and branches and arrives at unexpected places. Jack learned that Evelyn had once in 1987 organized a letter-writing campaign that resulted in a historic building in Billings being saved from demolition, and that she had done it entirely through the second-grade parents of that year's class, and that she still had the letter from the city council in a box she'd carried through every move since including the fire. He also learned, because Bobby told him, since Thomas wouldn't have, that Thomas had in 31 years of teaching been nominated for the State Teaching Excellence Award 6 times and had won it twice, and that both plaques had been in the apartment that burned, and that Thomas had not mentioned this to anyone since the fire. Jack looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Bobby. You're a snitch, Bobby, Thomas said. Mrs. Walker told me, Bobby said without shame, when you were getting more coffee. Thomas looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has no regrets. Jack was looking at Thomas with the full attention look, the one Thomas had registered in the first 3 seconds. 2 state awards, Jack said. It was a long time ago. A 31-year career, Jack said. Hundreds of students. Thousands, Evelyn said quietly. Thomas looked at her. I counted once, she said. When you retired, 31 years, 5 classes a year, 28 students on average per class. She paused. 4,340 students. The table was quiet. Thomas sat with the number. He had never counted, had never thought to count, had thought about individual students' faces, names the specific turning points of specific people, the ones he'd reached, and the ones he hadn't, and the ones he still wondered about. But he had never aggregated them into a number. 4,340. He thought about historical turning points, about individual choices that felt ordinary, about the students who had sat in the back of his classroom with the expression of people who had already decided that what was being offered was not for them, and the ones he'd found the way to reach, and what that reaching had done, and what those students had done with it, and what that had done in turn, the chain of it extending forward into the world in ways he would never be able to see or trace or measure. He thought about a door and a question. He thought about a parking lot in 1982 and a 12-year-old boy and a promise. He thought about chains, the way things linked, the way one moment becomes the reason for another, and that moment becomes the reason for another, and the chain extends in both directions backward into what created it, and forward into what it creates, and the people inside it can never see the full length of it, can only see the links immediately around them and trust that the rest of the chain exists and is bearing weight. He looked at Jack. "My turn," he said. Jack looked at him. "You told me what you'd say to the 12-year-old boy," Thomas said. "What would you say to him about the two people he was going to meet 46 years later?" Jack was quiet. "I'd tell him," Jack said slowly, "that they were going to remind him why he made the promise in the first place." He paused. "Not the parking lot. Before the parking lot. The reason underneath it." He looked at Thomas and Evelyn. "I'd tell him that sometimes you meet people who make the whole thing, all of it, everything you built, feel like it was pointing somewhere specific. Like it had a destination you couldn't see from where you started." He paused. "I'd tell him he was going to be glad he kept going." The table was still. Evelyn set her fork down. She looked at Jack Morrison across a Thanksgiving table in a Missoula apartment that 8 weeks ago had been empty and was now full, and she said the things she had been thinking since the parking lot of the clubhouse, when he had stood between Thomas and 3 men without hesitation or performance or anything except the pure mechanical response of someone fulfilling a promise. "Your grandfather," she said. "Harold." Jack looked at her. "He would be so proud," she said. "Not of what happened to him. Of you. Of every single person at this table, and what you built together, and what you did with a terrible thing, and who you became." Her voice was entirely steady. "He would be so proud, Jack." Jack Morrison sat at a Thanksgiving table in an apartment he had helped furnish, and looked at a 76-year-old former second-grade teacher who had spent 31 years finding the way to reach the ones who had already decided it wasn't for them, and he did the thing Thomas had now seen his face do 3 times. It opened. All the way. Not dramatically. Not in any way that required acknowledgement or comment. Just the specific full opening of someone who has received something they have needed for a very long time, and whose body in the receiving of it does the quiet, involuntary thing that bodies do when they finally set something down. "Thank you, Mrs. Walker," he said. "Evelyn," she said. "After Thanksgiving dinner, I think we've earned first names." He almost smiled. The almost smile became a real one. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said. The afternoon moved, the way good afternoons move slowly, generously, without urgency. The way time moves when it is being used for exactly the thing it is meant for. The pie from the aunt in Helena was, as described, the best apple pie in Cascade County. Bobby ate 2 pieces and was unapologetic about it. Danny updated Evelyn's informal health summary with the notation that her color and energy at Thanksgiving were the best he'd observed since her arrival at the clubhouse, and that her recovery trajectory was, in his assessment, excellent. She told him to stop making medical notes at the dinner table, and he said it wasn't the dinner table anymore because the pie was finished, and she told him she was going to start monitoring his blood pressure as revenge, and the table laughed. They left at 6:30 one by one, and in small groups, each one stopping to thank Evelyn, who received each thanks with the directness that was simply how she received things, the directness of someone for whom receiving was as genuine as giving, and required the same full attention. Jack was last again. He stood in the doorway and looked at the apartment, at the furnished rooms, the rug 2 inches left of where Bobby had first put it, the bookshelf full of history, the reading lamp in exactly the right place, the table still set with the remains of Thanksgiving. And Thomas watched him look at it with the look of someone who is confirming something he needed to confirm. "Good apartment," Jack said. "Good people who furnished it," Thomas said. Jack looked at him, then at Evelyn. "Same time next year," he said. Evelyn looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Jack. 2 o'clock, Thomas said. "Not 1:58. Jack held out his hand. Thomas shook it. It was not the handshake of a man meeting another man. It was the handshake of two people who have been through something together and have arrived somewhere real, who have found in each other the specific thing that most people spend their whole lives looking for, without knowing the name of it. The confirmation that the weight you've been carrying was seen, was worth carrying, and is now carried alongside something larger than yourself. Jack went down the hallway. Thomas closed the door. He turned around. Evelyn was at the window, her hands on the sill, looking out at whatever was there, the parking lot, the trees, the ordinary November geography of a life that was going to be lived here, from this apartment with its east-facing kitchen and its bookshelf and its table that had seated 11 people for Thanksgiving and would seat them again. "Thomas," she said without turning. "Yeah. We did it." He crossed to her, stood beside her at the window. "We did," he said. She turned to look at him. The real smile, the one he had been chasing since he was 17, the one that reached her eyes, the one he had never once taken for granted in 53 years of watching it arrive. "I love you," she said. "I love you, Evie," he said. She turned back to the window. He stood beside her. Outside, the November dark had come down fully over Missoula, Montana, and the parking lot lights were on, and somewhere on a highway not far from here, a group of men in leather vests were riding home through the cold, carrying with them the specific warmth of people who have done something true on a Thursday, and know it, who have lived up to a promise made in a parking lot 46 years ago, and have found that the living up to it is the best part, that it is the thing that justifies the weight of carrying it for so long. Thomas Walker had spent 78 years believing that the only thing you could count on was yourself. He had been wrong. And the wrongness of it, the beautiful, hard-won, door-opening, question-asking wrongness of it, had given him back everything. Not what he'd lost. Something better than what he'd lost. What he'd lost had been a house. What he'd found was proof that the world in its best and most surprising form still contained people who showed up, who drove through the night, who monitored blood pressure, who moved rugs 2 inches to the left, who carried lamps carefully, who brought their aunt's apple pie, who stood between old people and harm without flinching, who kept promises made by 12-year-old boys in parking lots for 46 years because the keeping of them was simply who they had decided to be. He had found proof that kindness, organized and committed and willing to show up at a door with a casserole dish on a Thursday in November was not naive. It was the most powerful thing in the world. And Thomas Walker, retired history teacher, husband of Evelyn Mann, who had walked across a gravel lot with shaking hands to ask one question. Thomas Walker stood at his kitchen window and knew with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has looked at the evidence and followed it to its conclusion that he was standing inside the proof. Sonnet 4.6. Low Claude is AI and can make mistakes.